Hello patrons. Tonight I've got this tutorial on how to draw ocean sunset using coloured pencils. And if you want to draw along with me, I do have the line art available for you guys. So be sure to download that so you can do this tutorial too. Now to start off with, I use ultramarine and I'm just doing a light layer. I'm following the lines where I know the clouds are going to go, and then taking middle phthalo blue and going over the top of that and just doing a light layer of that. And then I got a bit of helio blue reddish, and then I'm taking the ultramarine again and then going over the next section. That area there is cloud, so I'm trying to keep it lighter than the other section. And then I went over that section with a little bit of sky blue and also the cobalt blue greenish. And I'm trying to keep the layers light so that I can add in lots of layers, and I'm not limited. If you press too hard, you do limit the number of layers you can do. I do apologize for the camera. It was refusing to stay focused on the piece of paper, so it keeps blurring out slightly. I do apologize about that. So here I'm just going over the area with cobalt blue greenish, and I'm making sure that I get enough pigment down so that when I do blend it out, it blends easily. If you don't get enough pigment or enough layers onto the paper, it makes it a lot harder to blend with the odorless solvent. Darken that up a little bit with the helio blue reddish, and just so that you can see where those clouds are. Now it's time to blend it all out, and I've got my size 8 Taklon filbert brush and using my Art Spectrum Odourless Solvent. And I'm using a fair amount of the solvent on the brush at the moment. I do wipe the excess off always, but because it's the first layer, I'm tending to be a little bit more heavy-handed than normal with the solvent. It just makes it blend that much easier. You do have to wait for it to dry afterwards though. If you go straight onto a wet area, you can damage the tooth of the paper. And if you're wondering why it was coming up with a bit of a greyish tinge when I was blending, the bottle I was using has a bit of pigment left in it from previous drawings where I've wiped the excess back into the bottle. And so I tend to use it only on areas which I know are going to be dark, because that helps, because that pigment can actually make the paper darker than what I mean it to be. So do have to watch that. If you don't want to have that issue, wipe the excess off the brush onto paper rather than back into the brush. I'm a bit stingy and don't like to waste the solvent, so I just wipe it back into the brush, but you do back into the bottle. But you do have to watch out for the pigment, because the pigment comes off the brush and goes into the bottle. I have my big bottle of solvent, and then I have little tiny bottles, and I pour a bit of the big bottle into the little bottle, so that so I'm not messing up the main bottle of solvent, just the small amount that I have in the little tiny bottles. So in that section before, I did come over the clouds using rose carmine and some extra layers with those same blues that I've already used, and just building up those layers for those sections. And the rose carmine just gives those clouds a little bit of a pink tinge. Now using the white Polychromos and just going over and defining those clouds a bit and lightening it up a bit, adding a bit more onto the blue areas too, the darker blue areas I mean. Now I am pressing a little bit harder than normal with this white pencil, just to try and get it to go bright enough on the page. It's not a very opaque pencil. I do come back later with the Luminance pencil, which works much better. And I was drawing in tight little circles for that, rather than my normal broader strokes to get the coverage. The tighter circles just adds a bit of the texture that you might get with a cloud, the circular edge. Now finishing off this part of the sky. I tend to, when I'm working in skies with clouds like this, I work in sort of sections. Usually I would have gone all the way across the sky, but it didn't all fit on the camera viewpoint, so I've broken up into two sections. But it's a lot easier if you were to do this at home, or do this yourself. I would advise that you do that whole section of sky all at once, so because otherwise you have to try and match the two sections together, and that sometimes can be difficult. And sometimes you can get an obvious line where there's just a slight variation in color between the section you did first and then the section you did second. So if you can avoid that, that's a lot easier to do if you've done it all at once. My camera was having a lot of issues tonight, trying to keep the focus. It's a bit frustrating. Now, I was using the cobalt blue greenish just to add in a slightly green blue into the color of the sky, so it wasn't all that deep blue. I'm using the rose carmine on this cloud here and blending it all out. And then with the white Polychromos, I'm just getting that cloud shape in. Now this artwork I was doing as a Mother's Day present for my mother-in-law, so I had a bit of a deadline to get this done by, so I didn't do quite as many layers on the sky as I should have. You'll see in the final picture it's a little bit patchy, and it would have looked better if I'd gone over the whole sky area with a few more layers just to smooth it all out, but was on a bit of a deadline, so I didn't get the time to finish it off. I'm just using the white luminance pencil now to deepen up those clouds a little bit, add highlights on those clouds, I should say, and see how much more opaque that is than the Polychromos pencil. The white Polychromos pencil has its uses. You just got to remember it's not as opaque as what you get with the luminance pencil. Now onto the next section of the sky, and just sketching in the shapes of where the clouds are, and using the blue pencil, the ultramarine, to get the sky in. I'm not being too careful about the edges of where I know the clouds are, because the colour of the sky often bleeds a bit into the colour of the clouds, so you can be a little bit messy. And they have very random shapes, so if it's not quite exact, it really doesn't matter. And going over with the cobalt blue greenish, and then a bit with the middle phthalo blue. I don't want to do too much with the phthalo blue on this section, because you do want it to come a little bit more lighter as it goes closer to the horizon. And then using sky blue. and making sure there's a nice layer of pigment on there, on that section. And coming over with the sky blue on the clouds, not completely covering it all up, but getting a good layer. With these clouds, none of them were white. It's a sunset, and the clouds lower down are quite bright coloured, and these ones up the top are quite dark, and really not very bright, white bright, I mean. So I haven't really left any sections just white for these clouds. I also found that even though in the reference photo I was using, it had that band of cloud going quite horizontal there, it didn't quite look right when I was colouring it in. So in the end, I break it up quite a bit, and I come back a little bit later and go over it, breaking up that horizontal line so it doesn't look quite so stark. And then just blending all that out. And as you can see, I blended all that blue all over that cloud spot. So I'm not trying to keep it white. If it had white spots on it, I would have gone over it with the luminance pencil first to sort of keep that area bright white, but didn't need to worry about that in this one, as none of it was really a bright white colour. And now in this section, I'll start adding in some extra clouds and trying to make it look less horizontal and sort of make it more like following those diagonal lines of those original clouds. Now in this tutorial, I'm not using the titanium white powder blender. That would could definitely have been used on some of these clouds just to add a bit more definition and more opaqueness to the white. But as I didn't need it to be really white, I didn't worry about it with this piece. But definitely for clouds, if you do want to use the titanium white, it does add quite a good effect to clouds. It can make it quite a lot easier to get the effect, especially if you are doing wispy clouds and white puffy clouds. I'm just adding in more layers using ultramarine and the middle phthalo blue. I'm just blending it all out. At this point, I can start using less solvent on the brush, because if you start using too much, it does get it moves the pigment around too much, and it can get splotchy, and it will remove the smooth look of the sky if you're not careful. So in this particular piece, I needed to have done more layers to get that smooth look in the sky. But you know, my mother-in-law was quite happy with the piece, so I don't have to worry. I didn't quite get the sky as smooth as I usually would have. And here I'm just trying to break up that horizontal cloud line a bit and just adding in darker spots so that it sort of breaks up that whole band of clouds. I'm using the cobalt blue greenish just to add in a little greenish touch to that blue, and then further darkening it up. Now just blending it out again. A lot of this is just rinse and repeat. You just do the layers, keeping your pressure light, and then blending, then doing more layers and blending, and you just keep building up that until you get the intensity of color that you want. And then using the luminance white to add just a bit more highlights into these clouds. And a bit more shape as well, especially for the clouds where I've altered the clouds a bit. Need to add a little bit more into them than what was seen from what the lighter part of the paper that was there. And if you find your pencil's not, your luminous pencil's not doing enough opaqueness, sharpen it. It does a lot more when it's sharp. I am one of the artists which tends to work with blunter pencils than other artists. Because I'm using the solvent, I do find that I don't need to keep my pencils quite as sharp as other artists do. You'll find that other artists say that the pencil has to be sharp so that it gets into the white specks of the paper, but the solvent pushes the pigment in there, so I don't need it as much. The only time I really need the pencil sharp is when I'm working on fine details like fur. You don't want the pencil to be blunt then, because otherwise the fur will be really thick lines. Whereas if this sort of area, it doesn't matter if the pencil's got thick lines, because you're just getting the effect of the clouds. You're not trying to get individual strokes or anything like that. You don't have fine detail. And I'm blending that all out. I had to wait for that one to dry because that was quite a lot of solvent on there at that time. Now using the rose carmine, just adding a little bit of pink to those clouds, going over the white, because the white, as I've said in this picture, there isn't actually white cloud in this picture. It's all tinted with colour. So I've gone over it with the pink, and I find that the white, you can sort of do that. You can go over it with another colour pencil and it will tint the white, a bit like you do with glazing. And that's a good thing to keep in mind, because if you're trying to get a colour on, which you can't actually do because it's too dark. So if you wanted to get a yellow or a pink on, what you do is you can put white down first and then go over the top of that with the colour. It won't work if you burnish, but if you're still working in light layers and you've still got the tooth, you can go over the top of the white. And just continuing on with this bit of the sky. Definitely easier if you're working across the whole page rather than in smaller sections like that. Because you see the line between the first section and the second section, you've got to try and match that blue to make it the right colour. It can be difficult sometimes to match it so that it looks seamless. And sometimes when you can't match it, like in that spot, what you do is you go put a little cloud over the top and it hides it a little bit, which is what I've done there. So that's always a hint. If you can't match something like that, find a way to hide it. So in this case, I can easily hide it just by putting a cloud there. But yeah, always use artistic license. You can add things in, fix things up if you need to. Now adding in just a little bit of the blue sky down around these clouds. Now these ones are starting to get a lot darker and have more colour in these clouds. So I get to add in a few extra colours, which is always fun. Sometimes you get too much blue, too much of those colours that you use in the first part of the picture. You want to start getting to the other colours, especially for this one, because this one's such a bright picture. I was quite excited to get to the section where I could start adding in the yellows and the oranges. So just blending that all out. Now this section I didn't put enough layers down, so you can see I'm using quite a lot of solvent there to try and blend that out. I didn't have enough on the brush, so it was a little bit annoying. Didn't have enough on the paper, I mean, not the brush. I'm going over the clouds with the rose carmine. And now the sky blue. And the sky blue, I'm just doing it. It's pretty much a even coverage over the whole area. Just add a layer of pigment. And then the cobalt blue greenish. And then blending it out again. You see it's blending much better this time. And when I blend, I tend to do it in circles. So unless it's an area where I want, where there's a certain texture in a certain direction. So if there's a lot of horizontal lines, then I blend following that line. So I'll blend in horizontal lines. Or if I'm blending fur, I'll follow the line of the fur. But for here, in this sort of area, I use circular motions with the brush so that it makes it a smooth blend rather than going in all sorts of directions, because it does lift the pigment a bit and it can leave marks. There I was using a pencil called Light Aubergine, and that's a luminance pencil, and I absolutely love it. I've only just bought this one. I haven't had the chance to use it before, so this is my first piece with it, and it works so well for shadows. It's like this beautiful dark purple grey, and it's gorgeous for shadows, and it works so well in this one. It offset the oranges really, really nicely. Definitely a pencil that I'm going to use a lot. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm slowly adding to my luminance collection. One day I'll have them all, but at the moment, just, getting them a few at a time. I can't afford to buy them all at once, so just getting a few at a time, and can't wait until I've got all of them. So I've got a little bit of cinnamon and dark chrome yellow, and just adding that onto those clouds to add a little bit of colour into that cloud. And then going over some of these other ones with the dark chrome yellow. I do end up coming back over all these clouds at the end and adding a lot more colour to them. You wait until the end to do that, because if you add too much colour now, you can't take it away. And in the reference photo, there's not a lot of colour in the top clouds, but I found that when I was looking at it as a whole, I wanted that extra colour in those clouds. It made it look better, so I added that in. And then using a bit of scarlet red there, just to add a little bit of orange into that cloud. And on to the next section. And keeping the layers light and paying attention to where I want the cloud lines to go. In this section, the horizontal clouds look a lot better than that first one that I tried to do. It didn't quite suit it in that section, but in this one it did. I'm doing a layer of the sky blue and doing a nice even layer over the whole area. Now in this section I am being a bit more careful on where to leave areas a bit more white. Just because you're going to start getting those lighter yellows coming in. Going over in rose carmine. I found that the rose carmine was a really good pink for these clouds. It wasn't too bright. It was just the perfect sort of tone to add that pink tinge to those clouds and to sort of make them sort of a grey colour. It went well with the blue there. Now this section I needed a bit more, a few more layers on the paper before blending out. You can see I'm using quite a lot of the solvent to try and blend that out. Definitely need a few more layers there. I find that it's difficult to get the layers that you need at points where you don't want it to get that dark. You start having to put layers of lighter colors in to try and get the pigment on the paper, but without making it too dark. Especially for this section where the blue is the sky is starting to lighten as it gets closer to the horizon. I don't want the heavy layers that I had further up in the sky. And getting enough pigment on the paper can be challenging in these sorts of situations. So just starting to build up some of that colour in those clouds there. I'm using dark chrome yellow, a bit of cinnamon, and the rose carmine. Also used a bit of the light aubergine luminance pencil just to get that darker shadow on the bottom of the cloud. Now coming through with my luminance pencil just to further define those clouds. Putting a decent layer of it on some of those clouds to lighten them up a bit. And now just blending it all out. With this particular piece, I did go through it quite quickly. I was on a bit of a deadline to get it done as a Mother's Day present, so do bear that in mind when you look at the sky. I should have added a few more layers to make it a bit smoother than what I have done. My mother-in-law loves the picture, so it's all good. But if I was going to do this for a client, I would have gone over the sky with a few more layers to make it more of a smooth transition. If you look at the sky, you can see that it's there's marks in it and pencil marks that you can see. And now I'm just working on the bright part of the sunset. And so I'm using scarlet red and the dark chrome yellow, just keeping my pencil strokes horizontal to go with the direction that the clouds are. And they're just adding in some light aubergine to make those clouds quite dark. And I also used a bit of the cream in the brightest part of that. And I'm blending it all out. My Odourless Solvent has a little bit of pigment in the bottle, so that's why it went a little bit more grey than it should have when I blended it out. So that wouldn't have happened if you had a clean lot of the Odourless Solvent. You do have to be careful not to get pigment into the bottle if you wipe the excess of the solvent off your brush and let it run back into the bottle, because pigment will go from your brush into the bottle, and it can make it, over time, it does add pigment into the bottle, making it a bit grey. Now I've got the sun in place and just making it a lot more red using scarlet red. And also the light aubergine. Absolutely love that pencil for this piece. I used it so much. The first piece I've used it with, and I'm very impressed with that colour. I can see it being used quite a lot in the future for different pieces. It's great for shadows. And I'm blending all of that out. And then repeating over here. A lot of the time, I'm using the same method across the whole piece. It's just doing the light layers, paying attention to the reference photo, and making sure there's enough pigment on the page, and then blending it, and then repeating with making it a bit more vibrant. And here I'm making sure I pay attention to where those horizontal lines are. As you can see, you want the clouds on one side of the boat to match up with the clouds on the other side of the boat. You don't want them to be misaligned. So for this piece, do pay attention to where the clouds are on each side of the boat. And just darkening all of those up with the aubergine, the light aubergine. And then now coming over with ultramarine and just a little bit of blue into some of those clouds. Not too much, just a hint. And then blending it out. I'm not too worried about blending it over where the boat is, as the boat's going to be black. So it doesn't matter if I smudge it into the boat area. It'll cover it up. And darkening those clouds up a bit more with more ultramarine. Oh wait, that wasn't ultramarine, that was helio blue reddish. It was too dark for ultramarine. Yeah, definitely helio blue reddish. I'm just adding a bit into the clouds. And now I'm going to work on the part of the sunset over on this half of the page. I do find when you do blue and yellow together, you do have to be careful not to make it blend it too much and make it green. Sometimes that can end up with a bit of a greenish tint, so you do be careful doing the blue over the top of the yellow. That's when, if you want to darken it up, the purples work better. So like that light aubergine colour is great for the shadows on this one because it's not going to go green when it's mixed with the yellow. I'm just using white luminance pencil to lighten it up a bit, and then a bit of the ivory on the sun. And now onto this section of the sunset. I'm just blocking in the yellow on the whole area, the dark chrome yellow. And using cinnamon to get in some of those darker colours, darker spots with the clouds. And then now coming through with my light aubergine to get that bottom part really dark and add the shadows in on the clouds. Again, keeping my pencil marks all horizontal, as the clouds in this section are all horizontal, so if any of the pencil marks end up showing through, it'll just add to that effect of those clouds with the horizontal lines. Now I've added some rose carmine and then now the scarlet red. I'm just adding in, getting that nice mix of colours there in the sunset. As you can see, I never just use one colour. I never find the perfect colour. I always use a big mix of colours, and just it looks so much better when they're all mixed together. I often get asked, what colour did I use for this section, or what colour did I use, for the hair or the skin or the fur, but I never just use one colour. I never find the perfect one. There's always so many colours I use to get the effects that I am looking for in my artwork. In any one place, there's multiple colours all mixed together to get the effect that I create. Now I'm blending it out. The tricky part with this section is making it match the section I did first and having it look seamless across. And definitely, if you're doing this yourself, just work straight across the page. Don't do half the sky and have that line in the middle. It's a lot harder to match that if you just work in a band across the whole sky and then work down the page, not having your section split up across the page. That would make it a lot easier. Adding in a bit of sky blue onto that. You'll see how the white luminance pencil made it look quite hazy, and that's a nice effect that you can get using the luminance pencil more so than the Polychromos one. I think it's the extra wax. It just helps to make it move around a bit more than the Polychromos does. I'm just making it a little bit more brighter with the yellow and darkening it further. I'm just building up those layers until I get it to the effect that I want with my artwork. Adding in a bit of black along there where there's a little bit of land showing in the distance. And some more of the luminance pencil. Not keeping the pencil too sharp for this. It doesn't bother me that it's quite blunt. It's just as long as I'm getting the pigment onto the paper and then using the brush to smear it around a bit. At this point, the wax from the luminance pencil does allow it to get moved around quite a lot on the surface. When you blend, you do have to be careful at this point with blending because it can be quite streaky. But for this piece, I'm using that effect in the horizontal lines in the clouds to get the effect that I want. Now just working on the boat, and I've put down a little bit of the sky blue, and now just going over with the black. I'm just building up those layers to get it as dark as I want. And there is a little bit of texture in with the sails along the edge there, so I do have a lighter section. I'm not going just completely black silhouette. And blending that out. At this point, do be careful blending along the edge. You don't want to blend out over on top of the sunset. Otherwise, you don't want to smudge it that way. Otherwise, you'll get black marks, and it could end up looking a bit hazy. I'm not after a hazy looking silhouette. I want it crisp. But if you wanted a more blurry look, then you could smear it out. But yeah, that's not the goal I was looking for in this piece. So I am being careful with the edges when I'm blending. And with black, I do use a lot of black. I find that it looks better when it has other colors mixed with it. So I don't tend to use black straight on its own, but then I don't tend to use any pencil straight on its own. So it's no exception when it comes to black. I usually mix it with a blue or a deep purple or a deep red. There's one color I tend to mix with black a lot is Morton Violet. It's a deep browny reddish purple. It's a very rich color, and I think it works very well with black. So if I don't know what color to mix with black, that's the color I tend to use. And now onto the ocean. Just sketching in the lines and working out which ones are the light ones and which ones are the shadowed ones. So with the waves, the side which with the waves you've got the side which is closest to you, which is in shadow from the sun, and that's the darker line, and then the sort of gap in between the wave tends to be reflecting the sky itself, so it will pick up a lot of the colours from the sunset and be a lot brighter, whereas the side which is closest to us is that darker one. So the darker one I've done in the blue, and then now coming down and doing the one which is reflecting the sky in the rose carmine. And now that I've got those lines in place, I'm going over the whole section with a layer of the ultramarine. And then I'm going to start darkening it up even more, and this time I'm using the light aubergine. And you'll notice that I've got the watermark on the paper. Depending on the piece, I will either avoid it or I'll use it. For this piece, I wasn't too worried about it. I knew that I'd be able to cover it up pretty well with when I blend, because when you blend the solvent, it pushes the pigment around. It will fill up those letters, as you can see now. Sometimes it will be harder to cover it up. For this sort of piece, you won't notice it, but for a portrait, I'd be a lot more careful. Like, if you wouldn't want them there on a person's skin, such because it'd be a lot harder to disguise it if any of it did show through. I don't like wasting paper, so I'll use bits like this with the watermark, even if it does make it a little bit harder, because with each layer, the pigment catches on those letters, and you have to try and blend that out. And I did find sometimes you have to get the pencil really sharp and put it in the letters to hide it when if the pigment is sticking on the top and not blending in as much as you want it to. The camera's having issues once again with the focus. The camera was having a bad time with this picture. I don't entirely know what the issue with that is. It's very annoying. It keeps wanting to focus on something else other than the pages. It won't sort of catch the color. Like, it doesn't stick to where I'm drawing. It's trying to find the focus, which is a bit silly because, you know, the picture's right there in front of it. I'm just building up those layers, and you'll see that this side, those lighter areas are still quite dark on this side of the boat, and that's because they're reflecting a darker part of the sky. So it can be a little bit tricky at this point, telling which lines were for the light side and which were the darker part of the wave, which is closest to the viewer. It makes more sense when the rest of the sunset's in place. I'm just lightening up some of those lines in between the waves with the luminance pencil, and then onto the boat. As with all my artwork, I don't consider any section finished until I've done the whole piece, and then I come back and I do alterations to everything. You often find that once you've got all the colour on the page, that your values might not be quite right in some spots, so you have to go back and you have to change it. So yeah, I definitely find I never consider a section finished until I've decided that the whole piece is finished. So yeah, I haven't finished that section of the waves just yet. When you've got white against the area that you're working on, it's really hard to judge the values that you're doing and how much extra work the area needs. I'm just adding a little bit of pink into that shadow. You won't notice it too much, but it does just add that little hint to the shadow and the reflection. And then blending it out. I tended to use quite a large brush for blending on this piece. For pieces where I'm doing a lot of finer detail, I need to be a bit more careful where the pigment is going when you blend. I use a smaller brush, but for this one, it didn't matter so much. So it was quite a loose drawing. I wasn't too caught up on details. So I used quite a large brush, which makes it a lot quicker for blending. You do have to watch how much solvent is on the brush and allow time for the page to dry before drawing on it. So in this section, I've gone on to the next section, so I don't have to worry about waiting for the other section to dry, because it'll dry while I'm working on the next bit. So if I do want to add more detail, then I can go back to it once it's dry. I'm just blocking in my yellows. I'm paying attention to which ones are the waves which are facing the viewer. I'm adding in a little bit of the pink and that rose carmine. Got a bit of a thunderstorm going on here at the moment, so I'm hoping I'm going to be able to finish this without a power blackout. Should be okay. But yes, if you hear any big cracks of thunder, that's what's going on. I'm getting a nice even layer of the rose carmine, and you can see my pencil marks are still quite obvious there. I haven't gone out of my way to try and stop them from being seen. If I was going for a smooth effect, then I'd be a lot more careful with how I laid those initial layers down. But for this piece, because I'm keeping everything horizontal, if those marks show, it'll just add to the effect of the waves across the water. It's not that important to hide all my pencil marks in this piece. And adding some blue ultramarine on top of the light aubergine. I do have a reference photo for this, but I'm not being that careful on following it exactly. I'm just getting the waves roughly in the same spots, the size of the waves. So making sure that the waves in the distance are smaller than the waves at the front and things like that. That's what I'm looking at in the reference photo, making sure I'm getting those sorts of things the same, but I'm not making sure all the ripples are in the same spot, all the spots with where the light is, just generally getting it in the same spot. But yeah, this one is quite loose. My approach to it, I'm not stressing too much about getting it exactly like the reference photo. Now you'll notice there that when I start blending over that sun reflection, that was a bad mistake on my part. I had pigment on my brush from when I blended it from the boat reflection. So it was black pigment on the brush. So you can see what's happened. The pigment put the solvent on the brush. I haven't cleaned it on paper towel, and I've put it onto the paper on a spot which is supposed to be light, like the lightest point in the whole picture. And now it's this horrible greyish colour. Not so good. So that is why you make sure your brush is clean before going over a light area. It doesn't matter going from light to dark, but if you've worked on a dark area, clean your brush so you don't make mistakes like that. That is not so good. I'm going to have to take a lot of effort to try and lighten that up a bit. And I don't think I ever actually get it fully light. I make it a bit lighter, but yeah, not as light as it would have been if I hadn't done that. And because I've used solvent, it makes it quite hard to erase, so you can't really take an eraser and try and lift that up. It doesn't really come off very well once you've used solvent. Now I'm trying to lighten it up. So using a bit of the white luminance pencil, trying to brighten it and then going over it with the cream because I don't want it quite light. But yes, doesn't look quite the effect of what it could have been if I hadn't made that mistake. I decided I could live with it. If it was so bad that I couldn't fix it with the luminance pencil, I would have taken the titanium white powder from brush and pencil, mixed it with their touch-up texture, and then painted some of that on, and that would have made it white again, especially if you did a couple of layers and got it quite opaque. I could have fixed it up that way. So glad that we've got that option now. But yeah, do watch that with your brush. Clean it before you do a light area. So now just adding more layers and making that colour more vibrant and making the contrast between the waves, the front of the waves and the back of the waves, a lot more obvious, and just upping that contrast a lot. Sometimes I find when I do waves, my natural inclination is to make the front of the waves and the back of the waves almost the same colour, and it ends up making the sea look very flat. The more contrast you have, so making the front dark and the back light, that gives the effect of the bigger waves and the rolling waves. And you see, you think I would have learnt then. I did it again with the brush. I did it again. Oh, it's just shouldn't start on that spot. Never learn. But you guys will, because I've told you. And you've seen what happens when you do it. Clean your brush before doing the light area. And now just blending it all out some more. The darker waves down the bottom. Not being too careful on how well I blend out that bottom corner. It just, the brush kind of went in everywhere horizontally. I wasn't trying to keep it very close to where the top of the wave was or the bottom. It didn't. For that area, it doesn't matter because it's quite dark. And now I'm trying to fix up this side of these waves because I hadn't finished them off before, and make them look like they go across the whole sea instead of having them looking one way on one side of the boat and not quite merging with the ones on the other side of the boat. And then darkening up the boat as well and fixing up those reflections. I'm trying to hide those letters from the watermark. As you can see, the watermark can be hidden quite well, but it does add that extra bit of work that you have to do on that spot to make sure that the letters aren't seen. I mean, I can still see them slightly at the moment, but they're hidden enough that it doesn't really matter for this piece anyway. If that was on someone, on a portrait or a commission piece, I'd be a lot more careful, and I probably wouldn't have actually used the watermark section. As this one is just a gift, I'm not as concerned about issues like that. And I still want it to look good and don't want the watermark too obvious, but yeah, it's not as critical as for a paying client. I'm just altering, fixing up those clouds a little bit, adding a bit of darkness into them. And see the effect of the solvent on the picture before it dries. So there you have it. That's my ocean sunset. I did find that the scan was a little bit on the grainy side, so I'm not sure what the deal with that was. It wasn't quite as good. It looked a lot better in person than it did in the scan. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you again so much for supporting me. I really appreciate it all. Thank you. Bye for now.